Good afternoon, and welcome to a GlobalPlus conversation, how religion and science can work together for the common good. This conversation is part of the GlobalPlus project of the Association of Religion Data Archives here at Penn State and the International Association of Religion Journalists, an organization of some 650 of the leading religion journalists from 90 nations. And we are so grateful for the presence of each and every one of you here. And we also want to offer a special welcome to people throughout the world who are viewing this live on YouTube. It's not often we get a chance to have an intellectually humble conversation about this subject. Too often it's dominated by the extremes. But today we have the gift of three wonderful scholars who have done superb, nuanced research that talks about how religion and science can inform the other and move us forward. Before we begin, I'd also like to offer thanks to the Pascarilla Spiritual Center and our other co-sponsors, the Humanities Institute, the Rock Ethics Institute, and the Center for Spiritual and Ethical Development. Our first speaker is Christopher Scheitle. Chris, an assistant professor of sociology at West Virginia University, was the co-author with Elaine Howard Ecklund in the middle on her new book on religion and science. And well, Chris, you're gonna I can't remember the title offhand. I'm sorry, but you'll introduce it. Yeah, all right. In addition to his research examining religion and science, Chris has conducted research on topics such as religious discrimination and crimes against places of worship. He is the author of 3 books and over 50 articles. He also has been awarded 2 grants by the National Science Foundation. Not only one of the most prolific young scholars, but one of the most outstanding in his field. Chris?
Thank you. I did my graduate work here at Penn State, as some of you know, so it's a pleasure to be back, sort of on this side instead of a student on that side. Kind of weird, but nice. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of findings from the book that Elaine and I did, which itself was based off of a big project that had a national survey of U.S. adults, of about 10,000 U.S. adults, and what was the total? Over 300 interviews. And the title of the book was Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. Just came out last fall. So I'm going to start today by telling you about some survey patterns that will actually make you think that I didn't understand the prompt for today. So if you look at sort of national survey data of U.S. adults, asking U.S. adults how much confidence do they have in the scientific community. And you compare, let's say, 2 extreme groups, individuals who identify as very religious and individuals who say, I'm not at all religious. What you'll find is a little over a 20% confidence gap between those 2 groups, the very religious and the not at all religious, in saying that they have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community. Now, if you look at a different question that asks how much confidence do you have in religious leaders and religious organizations, you also see almost the same gap, just flipped, right? So if you think about 2 bar charts, I'm used to having these PowerPoints here, but if you imagine 2 bar charts, you essentially have 2 bar charts where the tall bar is on the opposite side, right? This, as I said, this seems to go against this idea of religion and science working together, because what it implies is that you have religious individuals sort of looking towards certain authority figures, and you have not religious individuals looking towards other authority figures. and sort of not listening to each other, essentially, right? But another way to look at it, maybe the glass half full sort of approach, is that if you can somehow stack those tall bars on top of each other, if you can find a way to merge those graphs, then you can actually unite these two groups, and that would form a strong basis for action and change. And so then the question becomes, well, how do you make this bar and this bar kind of on top of each other to be together, so they're looking at the same groups or the same authorities and have the same confidence in them? Today, I think all of us on some level are going to be saying that is possible. Is this too close? Is this? I couldn't tell if there was an echo on it. I want to identify three sort of principles that scientists and religious communities need to keep in mind as they try to make that a reality. The first principle is that both sides need to identify issues and language that tap into the central motivations of each community. Sociologists and political scientists who study this success and failure of sort of social and political movements, some of who I know are in the audience here, some of these scholars point to the importance of framing. And the basic idea, although I'm sure I'm butchering this very simplistically, but the basic idea is that you might have a very good cause, but if you don't talk about it in the right way, to put it more cynically, if you don't sell it the right way, it won't be successful. And you see this in religion and science issues as well. In the survey data that Elaine and I collected for our book, one of the things that we show is that if you ask U.S. adults how interested they are in quote-unquote new scientific discoveries, you actually do see that certain religious groups, in particular evangelicals, are less interested in science. And that seems to kind of go into the larger narrative that religious individuals don't like science, aren't interested in science. But the other thing we show in the book is that if you ask a different question, you say, well, how interested are you in quote-unquote new medical discoveries? Which obviously involves science, right? Now, you don't get new medical discoveries without some level of science. When you look at that, the patterns for that, you actually see it go away, that evangelicals are pretty much just as interested in new medical discoveries as the non-religious. Another, not in the book, but in another study that Elaine and I published, we asked U.S. adults, would you want your kid to go into different types of occupations? And when you look at occupations, if we ask people, would you want your kid to become a biologist, a physicist, a chemist? Again, you find that certain religious groups, particularly evangelicals, are saying, no, I would not recommend my kid go into that career. But if you ask about occupations like becoming a physician or becoming a high school science teacher, there you don't see any difference, that evangelicals are just as likely to say, yes, I'd want my kid to go into that field. Now, obviously, if you were going to become a high school science teacher or a doctor, you are going to be exposed to a lot of science. So how do we reconcile that in some cases we see this gap, this religious gap, in other cases we don't? Elaine and I argue, and I think other people have argued as well, that some of this is kind of this issue of framing, that talking about new medical discoveries or talking about becoming a physician or a teacher taps into central concerns and motivations of many religious communities and religious individuals that are concerned about issues of suffering, concerned about issues of caring for others. And so the key here is that if we talk about science in certain ways, we can actually grab onto, going back to the original metaphor, we can start to tap into that larger bar for the very religious individuals. Now, of course, many academics would say, well, new scientific discoveries are also going to help in suffering, care for people, and things like that. And that's undoubtedly true, but it's just an issue of framing it so it makes those connections for certain communities. The second principle I want to highlight, and that we highlight in the book, is that when there does appear to be the appearance of conflict between religion and science, or scientists and religious individuals, that both groups need to stop and ask, what is the actual kind of core issue at hand? It's often easy to get distracted and kind of say, oh, well, this is another example of religious individuals not liking science, or possibly scientists not liking religious individuals. And it's also easy to get distracted by conflicts over sort of technical debates. So for instance, oftentimes conflicts about, say, evolution will take the appearance of debates around the fossil records or the age of the Earth and things like that. But when you really dig down, you start to see that that's really, those technical issues are really just kind of a wrapping around more the actual issues that are of concern. We saw this a little bit in the survey data that we collected when we asked U.S. adults what their attitudes were about the origin of life and the world and universe. Many surveys will just ask kind of a yes-no question, like do you think humans evolved, or relatively simplistic questions. Our survey was a little bit unique in that we offered our respondents 6 different narratives, ranging from everything you might call kind of a young Earth creationist to sort of a purely naturalistic evolutionary perspective. And for each of those narratives, instead of just saying, well, which one do you like most, we asked respondents to rate each one on how definitely true or definitely false they thought each one was. And what we found overall, the bigger punchline from the analysis was that very few people are actually all that committed to any sort of narrative. What they are committed to is that whatever narrative that you put forward leaves room for their core concerns, particularly around some kind of existence of God or ability to interpret some sort of role of God in the world or history. Now, what that role is might just be kind of a personal interpretation issue, right? But as long as you tell them, or you leave some kind of window for that to exist, then they're fine. They don't really care if you say it's evolution or not. So based on such findings, what we argue in the book is that what is really of core concern is not kind of these technical debates about science and particular facts, but really this issue of the nature of God, and particularly also we talk about the sacredness of humanity. The final principle I want to talk about or sort of highlight here is that these efforts to have religion and science work together need to recognize that the quote-unquote religious community is not exclusive from the scientific community. Now, this seems kind of contradictory to what I started with. So I said earlier you have kind of the not at all religious and the very religious. And very often we assume that that group, the very religious, and the not at all religious, is sort of perfectly containing either being a scientist or not being a scientist. And it is true that lots of work, including some of the earlier work that Elaine has done, that among academic or PhD scientists in universities, you have much less religion, and even higher levels of what you might think of as kind of hardcore atheism, right? But a couple things to keep in mind about this is one is that that's even true outside of what you might think of the sciences. And so it's not really clear that that's a science effect. The other thing is that if you look at survey data for individuals who are outside of universities, so individuals who are working in areas that we might think of scientific occupations, in industry or other venues, you find that these gaps are much smaller or even non-existent in terms of the representation of religious individuals. In our survey, in our book, this is actually kind of a tricky issue because defining who counts as a scientist is something that academics fight over, essentially. But we tried to identify through a couple, kind of triangulate a definition based off of the actual occupation a person was working in, and also their self-identity as working in science. And when we identified those people outside of university, you find that the gaps are much smaller in terms of religious tradition, that evangelicals are still a little bit underrepresented, but nothing what you see among academics. There's two things that take away from that point. One is that cognitively, it helps us get away from this idea that if you are religious, you don't have anything to do with science, or if you're scientific, you don't have anything to do with religion. But it's also a practical implication that it means that there are lots of individuals, maybe your doctor, or maybe someone working in a manufacturing sector or something like that, that have knowledge, have experience with science, who can serve as Elaine might say in a minute, as bridge builders between communities. In using these individuals and recognizing that these aren't really two entirely separate communities is important. So these three principles are not necessarily the only things to keep in mind when trying to get religion and science to work together, but I think are, from our research, are particularly important to keep in mind as you go forward. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Elaine, our next speaker, Elaine Howard Ecklund, is the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and founding director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University, where she is also a scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Elaine's research uses social scientific methods to explore the public relationship between science and religion. Specifically, she has most recently studied how scientists in 8 different nations understand religion and spirituality. Elaine launched the Network for the Social Scientific Study of Science and Religion, N4SR, in 2011. In addition, through a cooperative project with the American Association for the Advancement of Science Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, she has studied how 4 different U.S. religious groups understand science. Now here's where the title comes in, that's where I had it. The book she wrote with Chris is Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. Please welcome Elaine Howard.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's my first time at Penn State, and I'm really loving it. So, and thank you very much, David, for sponsoring this dialogue. This is a really important thing to be doing. I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm going to build a little bit on what Chris just talked to you about, which is it's based on our book, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think, as well as take you back a little bit to some earlier work I did on scientists' understandings of religion in the U.S., and that book is called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think. So you get it? So hopefully those books will sell together. So after 5 years of research that Chris and I have done on religious people of different types and comparing them to the non-religious just in the U.S., here are some insights we've gleaned. And I'm going to build on the nice work that Chris did laying out some of our empirical findings and talk about 4 kinds of ways that I think there can be some common ground between religious groups and scientific groups, recognizing that there is overlap. I think Chris pointed that nicely, that to be a religious person does not necessarily mean that you are not a scientist, and to be a scientist does not necessarily mean that you're not religious. So first, I think we can start with common ground. And I think this is especially important for scientists to start thinking about the common ground that they potentially have with religious people. This is not intuitive. This is not intuitive given that we hear very loud voices saying there's not much common ground. But here's some things we know about religious people from the studies that Chris and I have done. That religious Americans of all types are actually interested in and appreciate science, that they're interested in and appreciate science. They're open to accepting new narratives concerning the origins of life and the development of life on Earth. They're not inherently hostile to environmentalism or technological progress. They actually care about protecting the Earth and helping others. Yet, and here's where the rub is, I don't think we want to be Pollyanna-ish and say that there is no conflict. Here's where the rub is. Religious Americans, particularly evangelical Christians, care deeply about maintaining an active role for God in the world, and at least for the Christians and also Jews and some Muslims we talked with, protecting the idea that humans are created in the image of God and thus hold a special place in creation. I'm not saying scientists should start talking theology. We ought to remain in our academic domains to some extent. But here's a little bit of advice for how they can totally advance science for the common good while not ticking off religious people on the side. And I think that that will help us get towards some common efforts that our society really needs. So here are some ways that we think that Chris and I argue in our book are actually some potential areas of common ground. So religious people express interest in science. This is especially the case when science is perceived to tap into the concerns of helping humanity. And Chris pointed that out nicely. That's why religious people are a whole lot more interested in what we might think of the applied uses of science and less interested in basic science. Basic science is very important. I'm a huge advocate. I actually married a particle physicist because I have a huge affirmation for the importance of basic science, and for other reasons as well. But I do think that this is where scientists can perhaps do a better job of framing science as being about, in part, helping humanity, and that will go a long way. Also, second point, the science community and the religious community, and particularly those groups, conservative Christians, conservative Muslims, Orthodox Jews, all of those groups sometimes have tension with science. There is a way to see scientists in the pews as bridge builders. So building again on what Chris said, when we look at elite universities, there are fewer conservative religious faculty present in those universities. But outside of top universities, actually 17% of scientists outside of top universities actually identify as evangelical Christians, a little bit less than the general population, but not that much less, and 24% as part of the mainline Protestant, one of the mainline Protestant traditions. So there are those scientists, we call them scientists in the pews, who could, to use a very particularly Christian metaphor, who could actually be bridge builders. We don't think of church as a place where there is the capacity to do a lot of science outreach, but that maybe we need to expand our understanding a little bit. So we've come to think of these people, religious scientists, as perhaps having the most potential to be effective bridge builders between scientific and religious communities, because they may be people who are trusted by both the scientific community and the religious community. Some of these scientists even believe that religion can meaningfully interact with their research. We didn't find in our studies any religious scientists who think that they're doing a different kind of science, but they do attend to particular kinds of human concerns that perhaps are molded by their faith sensibilities. I've talked to scientists in my past studies who, for example, wouldn't take funding from particular kinds of corporate sources because of what they believed about those corporate sources the impact of their activities on the natural environment. So they were sort of especially pro-environmental out of their faith sensibilities. So there are ways in which the faith sensibilities of scientists can intersect sometimes with the religious sensibilities of those in their congregations who are non-scientists. So think of those people as potentially bridge builders. Thirdly, and this is speaking directly to religious communities, our hope some of our listeners, our virtual listeners, are people who are actually people of faith themselves and part of faith communities. There is a space, especially for religious leaders, to foster the engagement and support of science. So encouraging discussions about science in youth education environments. Also seeing science itself as potentially a form of calling, that there might be a sort of sense where being a scientist might be seen by a faith community as a calling to better the world, that there's a way in which there's kind of a confessional sense where science is a kind of calling. We also want to see religious leaders in particular as supporters of scientific advancement and as drivers of change. Our larger data set for the religion versus science, what religious people really think book shows that evangelical Christians and some mainline Protestants and some Muslims do look to their religious leaders, but particularly evangelical Christians look to their religious leaders for guidance about the application of science. And so since religious leaders have a particular voice in those communities, it behooves religious leaders to then thoughtfully reflect on how science is used in society, how they can connect to scientists in their midst and use them as resources. There's a real chance for religious leaders to be the drivers of change here. Fourthly, scientists are very concerned about issues of diversity. And I think there's a way in which the scientific community and religious communities might work together to increase access to science for all. We know that having good science education, training in science, actually increases the likelihood over one's lifetime that you will earn more money. Sociologists of education tell us this. We know that African Americans and Latinos are two of the most underrepresented groups in American science. These are also two groups which are overrepresented in certain religious traditions. Faith communities have talked a lot about their concerns about particular scientific issues like evolution. Of course, everyone in this room have heard those debates played out on the Times, even on the front pages of America's newspapers. But what if the new faith and science issue were increasing access to science education, increasing diversity in science through faith communities? What if faith communities were seen as a potential avenue towards social equality in science rather than as a problem for science? That's a kind of radical vision, but our goal, as in this study, in part, was to bring to the table other voices, not just white evangelical Christian voices, but also African American Latino voices in our broader study. We've just begun in our research. I'm starting a small study at Rice University to explore how churches, which are the main civic organizations in which the majority of Black and Latino Americans are involved, might actually be utilized to increase minority representation in STEM. In the data that Chris and I collected, we had one Latino pastor, for example, say, I do think it's helpful to have somebody of your own skin color in science as well as someone of your own faith to see one of your own would give a kind of inspiration to our youth. An African American pastor said to us in our data, science is still a no trespassing zone for a lot of African Americans. So increasing socioeconomic and racial diversity in science might be the kind of thing that both faith communities and scientific communities could get on board together for the common good. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. One of the joyful aspects about our gathering today is that we're fortunate enough not to have only three outstanding scientists, but three wonderful people, and who it's been my pleasure to get to know over the years. Our third speaker is Jenny Trinitapoli. And I should have checked with you, Jenny, about the pronunciation of your name beforehand. Got it? Okay, great. Jenny's work bridges the field of social demography and the sociology of religion. And she's an associate professor at the University of Chicago. She has written extensively about the role of religion in the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2008, she has been the principal investigator. Now this, I might need your help, to Segolo Lathanzi, an ongoing longitudinal study of young adults in Malawi, which asks how young adults negotiate relationships, sex, and childbearing in the midst of a severe AIDS epidemic. Trinitapoli is the co-author of Religion and AIDS in Africa, and those of you from Penn State, I'm sorry, those of you from Penn State may remember Jenny is a teacher here, and as a teacher here, she won one of the major faculty awards offered by Penn State to young scholars. Please welcome Jenny Trinitapoli.
Thank you, David, for the invitation to join old and newer colleagues here, and to get back to Penn State. It's really a great trip for me. Thank you. I also want to thank Chris and Elaine for setting the bar for these comments. Very, very high. When I started thinking about David's invitation and the prompt for this conversation, really about science and religion working together for the common good, my first thought was a little bit antagonistic, and before I went on the record saying science and religion can work together for the common good, I wanted to make sure that I had thought my way through the alternatives, and there are sort of three that I wanted to situate this in. The first is the conflict perspective, wherein science and religion can't work together for the common good, because this is a perspective that views this as a fundamentally antagonistic relationship, right? From this perspective, science and religion are enmeshed in a constant and ferocious battle to which there is no end in sight. And this is a perspective I think we're all familiar with. It's common, especially to those of us who inhabit scientific and intellectual communities. And it's also well understood because I think some of the voices that insist on the conflict perspective are some of the loudest voices in our society. And I'm going to say more in a few minutes about loud voices. The second perspective is something I would call separate magisteria. There's no conflict between science and religion, but only because these are two phenomena that are speaking to different questions and different ways of knowing. When I was prepping these remarks, I found myself trying to explain separate magisteria to a 10-year-old, and I was tripping all over myself. So I found myself going back to terms, to a teasing phrase my dad would use with me when I was little and trying it out on my own kids, and he would say, "Hey Jen, do you walk to school or do you carry your lunch?" From this perspective, religion's great, science is great, and both of these things can be great because as long as everyone's sticking to their own territory, we can walk to school and carry our lunch. And this is the separate magisteria view, right, where these things coexist because they stick to their own territory and can keep to themselves. And I think the third position, the one raised in David's prompt, is distinct because this is a vision not just of coexistence, but also cooperation. Maybe it's not taking it too far to say that it would also involve interdependence. It also has the implication that religion and science working together is generative and productive towards a common good. So given that the world that we live in today has no shortage of major problems, this is a really seductive view. It runs contrary to the perspectives that are advanced by the loudest voices in our society today, and it's also fundamentally distinct from the taking a walk, having your lunch wisdom that is a common alternative. And I'd like to advance it, but I'd like to do that. Elaine used the term Pollyanna-ish, and I'd like to do it from a firm foundation rather than just from a place of blind optimism. And for those of you who know me, some of you in this room know me very well, I lived and worked here for a very long time. I'm not much of a theorist. I tend to be inductive almost to a fault. So I'll spend the rest of my time and the rest of my comments going to data and some findings from research that I've done on the role of religion in the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to speak primarily about Malawi, which is a small and landlocked country that experiences one of the region's worst AIDS epidemic, and it's the country I've worked in the longest, and I know the best. I started working on questions related to religion and HIV in Malawi in 2004, and this was a time in which HIV prevalence among adults stood at about 15% of the population had HIV. Absolutely no treatment was available in the country of Malawi. And people like you and me were attending, on average, about 8 funerals each month. So this was the context I started my research in. Now, a lot of the questions I get from people, and are the same questions that I started with early on in this research. I was thinking about differences in religious groups. Are Muslims protected? Are Catholics at a heightened risk of getting HIV, maybe because they're forbidden from using condoms? What are the differences between these religious groups that we could find? Thinking about HIV and religion almost as it was a foot race between these groups to identify who had the best outcomes, who had the worst outcomes, where should we intervene? And when I started working in local communities and interviewing religious leaders, conducting participant observation in religious services, the regular weekly services, and doing this systematically, I learned that these were the wrong questions, and I would do well to get rid of them very quickly. When I stepped back from thinking about religious traditions in terms of blocks: Catholic, Muslim, Pentecostal, traditional religion, and I started looking at the particular characteristics of what was going on in local religious communities. I saw that the most important differences were often taking place within those religious groups. And they related to the main difference was whether they were talking about AIDS at all, right? Whether they were talking about it primarily as a scientific issue, primarily as a religious issue, or in a combination, right? So they were addressing religion, but they were doing it from a place that engaged both religious and scientific language. And so by using survey research from individuals and the systematic view of the congregations they were related to, I was able to identify the patterns of sexual behavior that were present among people according to the messages that they were receiving in their religious communities, right? No message, religious messages, scientific messages, or combination messages, right? So for those of us who are like into data, interaction term, right? And what I found was that individuals who were attending congregations where they were hearing moral messages and scientific messages about HIV, they were more likely, if they were young adults, to be abstaining from sex. They were more likely to report being faithful to a partner among married people. If they weren't abstaining and being faithful, they were more likely to be using condoms. And they were also more engaged in practices of visiting and caring for sick friends and congregation members, people who needed care beyond their immediate kin. Where just one type of message was present, just religious or just scientific, they didn't have the same association with the behaviors of members, at least not as with their reported behaviors, right? And this is something that I read as real evidence pointing towards this third position, right, of religion and scientific knowledge coming together for a common good. We have the co-presence of these types of religious and scientific, both moral and scientific messages about a pressing issue that is actually taking the lives of many adults in that population at an alarming rate. Yes, no study is perfect. These studies weren't. The causal identification is not completely rock solid and airtight in this, but it does point in a really important directions. And I think it also gives another lesson in this research, another point that I would like to make about sampling. Now, it takes a very particular kind of sociologist to take the prompt that David gave and come away with something to say to an audience like this about sampling. But this goes back to the issue that I started with about the loudest voices, and I think that this is something that's also compatible with the work that Elaine and Chris are doing and with the approach that they've described. When it comes to religion, we tend to focus on the loudest voices, and when we do that, we err in our interpretation of things. I don't think I need to come up with a list of names, but I think the people with the loudest voices or the people with the most Twitter followers are not representative, and we know this from basic sampling theory, right? What this means is that these voices point us towards stuff, and yes, stuff, that's not the scientific term, but they don't point us towards the stuff that constitutes real religion as it's lived in communities for most people. And so in this research in Malawi, studying religious congregations in particular, I did systematic observations in 200 religious congregations, and I observed one in which there were some very, very alarming conspiracy theories about HIV that were circulating, in addition to fraudulent claims about an herbal cure. 1 out of 200. So that was present, but it wasn't a dominant issue. On the other hand, if you go to some of the major media reports, you see lots and lots of stories about these things that are happening when it's not common at all. So I'd like to share one quick example about what a typical religious message about HIV looks like in a place where prevalence among adults stands at 15%, and people are attending about 8 funerals in a month. This is from a homily given by one of my favorite respondents. You're probably not supposed to have favorite respondents, but this was a Catholic priest with a very large congregation. There were probably about 600 people there on this Sunday. The congregation on the local community had a heavy burden of HIV. And this homily was about a foolish man who had found a snake pit outside of his house. As you will see, this message is not actually about a snake pit at all. So one day, there was a foolish and boastful man who curiously stuck his arm into this snake pit he found outside his house. Fortunately, this was an aggressive kind of snake, not the kind that you want to run into. The snake did not attack the fool, but instead of being thankful for his good fortune, this man went around bragging to his neighbors, and he said, "Look, it's a snake. It cannot bite me, this snake." Every day, the man would stick his arm into the snake pit and brag about it. The neighbors counseled him that sticking his arm into a snake pit was not a good idea, but he did not heed their warnings. They became bored with his foolishness, and they began to ignore him, shaking their heads whenever he came around and whenever he had more to say about the snake pit. And on the day the snake finally did bite him, none of these neighbors were very sympathetic. Now, this story was told to an audience that included small children, had the grown-ups on the floor rolling with laughter, even in trying times in their community. This was not a message of fire and brimstone. It was pragmatic and good-humored, and it was typical, also effective. In addition to these types of moral, religious messages about HIV, this priest was also doing a lot of other things, including promoting HIV testing to detect infections among members, providing nutritional guidance, and cultivating a vegetable garden that had and a seed exchange program that had sort of more variety of seeds and plants to be able to enhance nutrition for both positive and negative members in the community. And it takes a scientific approach to find this story. It takes an approach that involves sampling and attending at least 200 congregations in order to find out what is typical and what is really going on. It also takes a scientific approach to identify the positive consequences in a context like this one. But I think it truly does provide us with something, with a little bit more of an evidentiary foundation from moving away from the conflict perspective or the separate spheres perspective and towards an understanding that can prioritize and really give sort of tangible examples about cooperation between religion and scientific ways of knowing as promoting the common good. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you to all our speakers. These are wonderful, thoughtful observations. And now we come to the program, part of the program where each of us contributes to an international dialogue on science and religion. And if I just may take the privilege as moderator to ask the first question. Each of you presented some specific ideas about how we can move forward in terms of science and of claiming a more accurate, nuanced narrative about science and religion. But if I may ask both, Chris, Elaine, and Jenny, what about taking it even further and some on-the-ground proposals? Like as to what you think would be helpful in different communities to see the relationship between religion and science and how they can be beneficial to each other. I mean, I was just curious, one idea that came to mind is, I think you mentioned in your book about scientists visiting religious communities, and I'm wondering if even in terms of something similar to an interfaith effort, a religious scientist and a non-religious scientist coming together. I remember, Elaine wrote one of our GlobalPlus overviews as part of the GlobalPlus project that was the inspiration for this seminar. And I believe, Elaine, you spoke about every single person, whether they were Catholic, evangelical, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, considered themselves a scientist first. When it came to their work, they were all scientists. And it would seem that just hearing that, and even going to a humanist group or something, just hearing that would seem to be helpful. But I'll just let you offer some, what you think might be some specific on-the-ground ideas they could use at State College or in or anywhere in the world.
Well, I'll just say a couple more related to that prompt, David, and then others I'm eager to learn what Jenny and Chris think as well. So I do think that scientists have stereotypes about religious people, and religious people have stereotypes about scientists. This is particularly acute in specific science communities. So scientists who work at elite research universities, I think, have more entrenched stereotypes, partly because they have quite restricted social networks. So you spend a lot, if you're a scientist at a place, and I'll put Penn State as one of those kinds of places where you have some very high-performing science departments. If you're a scientist at a Research One university, you spend a lot of time doing your science. And your life has been about science for quite a long time to achieve what it takes to be a professor at those kinds of positions. And so those folks are particularly unlikely to have social networks that are outside the scientific community. It's not that there aren't any scientists who are religious people at those universities. There certainly are people there, but it's a somewhat less likely than at research and development of a corporation. So I think that it's incumbent on those types of scientists to try to dispel some of their stereotypes of communities they might be likely to have stereotypes of. And so we found in our research that evangelical Christians are the group that scientists, at least in the U.S., seem to have the most stereotypes of. When I have done research in other national contexts where the religious ecology is quite different than it is in the U.S., in some of the nations I've studied, Muslims were a group where there is an incredible amount of stereotyping amongst some scientists. Turkey was one of those nations, for example. So to get into to have the scientists visit communities, and also I think we found in our research that evangelical Christians and even mainline Protestants, Jews, and Muslims that Chris and I studied for our book also had stereotypes of scientists, particularly two kinds of stereotypes. They tended to not believe that scientists could be persons of faith and be scientists, even if there were actual scientists in their congregations, which was kind of intriguing. We got the sense that scientists in those congregations didn't really talk very much about being scientists. They might say be part of some kind of committee, some vestry committee or something in their church, or be part of the music team. But really, do they really talk about being a scientist? And then secondly, religious people sometimes have pretty entrenched stereotypes of who atheist scientists are. They don't understand that not all atheist scientists are, in the Christian context, are not all atheist scientists are out to eat young Christian children for lunch. I mean, there is a really entrenched stereotype of who atheist scientists are that doesn't have appreciation for the variety of ways of being an atheist scientist. And so I think it's incumbent on those faith communities to then have more exposure to the variety of scientists. I went on too long, but that's a prompt I feel strongly about. So. Oh, you have your own.
So I'm in my third. This issue of on the ground collaboration is interesting because I'm in my third year at West Virginia University, and West Virginia as a state, is sort of number one on every social problem, right? Like whether it's health or opioid or pollution or whatever it is, we're number one, right? But it's been interesting being at the university as a state land grant school that a lot of my colleagues' work would be very naturally lend itself to working with faith communities. There's a lot of people working on things like river pollution and things like that. Well, guess what? There's churches and places of worship that are on those rivers, right? It wouldn't be that hard of a stretch to reach out to those groups to see what kind of role I mean, not necessarily in the doing of the science per se, right? That's a different issue, but to at least involve them in some participatory way about how this is important, how it affects them. And honestly, a lot of times they already know that, right? So it's not like a hard sell to them that, yes, this is a problem. And in fact, many times it's the churches that are already working on those things, right? Like they already have opioid outreach issues or ministries, as they would put it. And so being at WVU, it's been interesting because I don't think those connections are always made, but there is a lot, what I perceive to be a lot of opportunity for those types of connections. So,
I'll add, with saying a little bit more about the example of HIV, which is early on in the epidemic. I think a lot of public health researchers that were addressing HIV and wanted to bring in religious leaders were sort of operating under the assumption that they could use religious leaders as an emergency alert system of sorts, right? Like we can get them this information about HIV, which people didn't already have yet, right? At the time, the disease was still mysterious to a lot of people. Mode of transmission was still a little bit confusing, and the information needed to get out there, right? However, I think the instances we have where the religious messages have been disseminated well and where it's gone well, and we've seen the highest levels of cooperation between the knowledge that was being produced on the public health side and the messages that were being disseminated quickly and efficiently in rural communities, are where religious leaders were involved in the conversation. They were trained and given information, and they were asked to help in their communities, right? And that's very, very, very different from being told what to do. Nobody likes being told what to do, right? Go into your congregation and tell people XYZ that we have on this pamphlet, or repeat this that you heard on the radio program. People don't like to do that, right? But when they have a lot of information and they have knowledge of sort of the needs and the tastes and the questions in their communities, the ability to read and sort of to adapt to the situation and deliver messages that were more effective, right? Like the story about the snake. Like no one would have come up with that story from a public health, from the public health sort of information generating machine, but everyone knows what is being talked about, right? And I think that approaching these collaborations, as a two-way street on the ground, and providing a lot of information, and asking people to use some of their own strengths and skills, and appreciating what those are among the religious community, to have flexibility and some trust in how in how messages get delivered, right? Because it can't be a totally like top-down effort or endeavor.
Thank you. And some questions? Yes? We'll bring a microphone over to you.
Elaine, when you were speaking, you listed 4 major points. And in the very first one, you mentioned that a common denominator was that amongst religious people, they felt that there should be a special place for humans as children of God and in God's image. Did you then go on to, I was wondering, because it seems to me, and I was wondering if you actually divided these into 2 subgroups, because there's one group of religious people who feel that as special people, being special in the eyes of God, are here to protect God's creation and be stewards of the environment and of all of God's creation. And then there's also a group who feel that God intended for humans to dominate the earth and to do what they want to with the earth, and feel no remorse at species dying off and or desecrating land in order to gain lots of minerals and that type of thing. So you have these 2 subsets of saying, yes, I'm special in the eyes of God, but their role is divergent. Did you look at it in that regard?
We did. So Chris can feel free to speak to this too. That's not the kind of nuance that you get at well through survey research. So we could look from our survey at things like views on climate change and how both politics and religion, politics is a stronger driver of views on climate change than is religion. Actually, religious, interestingly, in some of our published research, we show that religious participation, even among evangelical Christians and conservative Jews and others, actually blunts the conservative political effect of attitudes towards climate change. So you're a bit more likely to be pro-environment if you're actually participating, versus we think of sort of, we call it in our paper like Fox News Christians. You're not actually participating, but you're getting particular kinds of religio-political ideas from, say, your news sources or things like that. That's a different kind of thing. So climate change is a kind of tricky one where politics, religion, and attitudes towards climate change are sort of intersecting in interesting ways. But through our interviews, we were able to go a little bit deeper into the, why would you be a believing Jew or Christian or Muslim and be against, really think that you didn't have any responsibility towards the environment. And there is a particular theological approach that I think you point out nicely in certain Christian forms of theology that's just sort of like, why polish the brass on a sinking ship, right? You ought to be about saving souls, and there's that one kind of vein of thinking, but also the dominion vein of thinking, and that did come up in our interviews. But we found that for the people that have the dominion thinking, where humans are special and they're supposed to dominate the earth, that they weren't just about dominating the earth, but they were also about helping other humans. And they thought helping humans and ending suffering for humans is going to be much more important than caring whether the polar bears die out or not. We have these powerful quotes, if I have to choose between the polar bears and a dying child, I'm always going to choose the dying child. So their understanding, and you may say, well, that's not a very nuanced way of thinking about it, right? But it was helpful for us to listen to that, because that helps then figure out an antidote, which is that for certain religious groups, scientists need to help them understand how not caring about the environment means that you don't care about humans too, because those places that are the most polluted are also often the poorest places, right? If you have resources, you're not going to live next to a polluting factory. The places where flooding hits the worst are also the poorest places. You're going to have money to raise your house up or move someplace where there's not flooding, right? So the sort of social justice consequences of not taking care of the environment need to be pointed out more clearly to particular religious groups. And so that's the kind of way that I think social scientific research can help us understand some antidotes, if we want them, to particular social problems, or at least how framing can be done in a more effective way.
Did you find in your study at all a gap between the approach for the scientific community? It's all research-based, right? So they gather the data and they get their statistics. But oftentimes your religious communities are all experientially based. So that, one has a more difficult time perhaps connecting with the other because there's a misunderstanding or a mistrust of how you come to what you know.
Yeah, I think some of the findings I talked about in terms of the distinctions between, say, quote unquote, new scientific discoveries and something about medicine or something more applied, I think that some of that effect is getting at what you're saying, is that to us as academics, science for science's sake is kind of appealing, right? But for many people, and I would say, frankly, for my parents and grandparents and things like that, that doesn't appeal to them, right? They don't but if I explain to them, I'm going to do something that will then help you do something better or live longer or make your life easier in some way, then that is, right? That's not necessarily a religious divide per se, but I think one of the things that we get at our data is that there is something, particularly as we say with evangelicals, that they are particularly have appeal with things that seem like it's going to, again, get back to this humanity issue, help humanity in some way, right? And so, yeah, I think there is something there that you're getting at. So.
Roger?
I think you each touched at least a little bit on as far as the differences as far as in religion and probably also in science as far as by race and gender and age. I don't think came up, but probably age as well. When you look at this relationship between religion and science, are there sort of key differences and findings you have from those different categories? Is there variations in how people of different races or different genders look at this relationship?
You can speak to the general population, I'll speak to scientists, because I just read a couple papers.
So for the book, we did not actually break out. We had conversations about, should we break groups out by black and white or other, partially for kind of, I guess you would say, just narrative purposes. We kind of kept it on focusing on religious tradition differences. So I guess the short answer is we haven't done too much to see how particular religion patterns differ by age or by race, but this actually came up at a different event a while back, that there definitely is something about, and I think other research has gotten this, about particularly about the race effect, that and someone, audience member, said something essentially about that the dynamics are very different in African American communities and black churches, and I think I don't know if you can probably add to that.
No, that's exactly right. So for the book, we didn't do that as much, although for the qualitative research, we specifically focused on African American communities, Latino communities, in particular for these reasons, that we wanted to get at racial and ethnic variation among Christian groups, because those are so incredibly salient in American society. And then I have then written with some student colleagues at Rice University a couple of articles where we look at race and science, and the race differences are particularly salient, that there's not as much concern amongst African Americans in particular about evolution, that really is a majority white evangelical issue, that there is a lot more concern about issues of religion and medicine, and what we might call, there's a whole public health literature about medical mistrust in minority communities, in part because of historic factors and a community of memory from the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And so there's just not this kind of intense trust of medicine and doctors that there is in some communities. And so that has come out in these data, interestingly, as well. I wish in setting, you don't want to say this as a researcher, but it's true and it's how we advance. I wish in the way that we'd set up our survey, we'd attended to that possibility more. And I would encourage others to do so, that separating out basic science and medicine can be very useful. I don't think we did that enough in our survey, but that's something for other researchers to follow up on. Yeah. I want to say something about scientists, too, where there's also quite big demographic differences among scientists. But go ahead with the other question.
Well, and the other question is related to Jenny, but also to either of you as well, is with gender in Africa and Malawi, were there differences in receptivity to this as far as by gender?
Yeah, so in Malawi, as in most countries from which we have good data, women tend to have higher levels of religious involvement than men. Religious involvement's pretty high in Malawi. Like when you're looking at people who are high participants, you're looking at people who attend every week and are singing in the choir and are going to sort of other religious services and participating in other religious activities every week. In terms of like the actual patterns of behavior that we found for men and for women, in terms of like hearing these messages and then conforming to like the prevention advice of abstain, be faithful, and use condoms, those relationships were consistent for men and for women. So the relationships themselves were consistent, even though the levels were not, or the levels can be different by gender. One very interesting gender difference that I did find, or gender story in this research, is that women in the 200 congregations, 6 were led by women, and women don't have a lot of power in many parts of Malawi, especially in patrilocal societies where they can't own land and they move into their husbands' homes. And one of the sort of strategies that I found in some of the communities that I was observing in is women who would gather and talk to their religious leader and say, remember when you talked about that disease a few weeks ago and you told the men that they shouldn't be drinking too much and they need to be coming home at night? We need more of that, right? We need more messages about these things. You need to say more. And so basically one of the ways in which they were sort of communicating to their spouses, in addition to the conversations they were having at home, was by asking for more involvement and more information from the religious leaders, like basically, by request. And that was an interesting and sort of unexpected gender dynamic, right, that I saw playing out in religious congregations there.
Yes. In the back row.
I was thinking that if you wanted them to get together, we're all terribly tribal, aren't we? And I was thinking about your vicar, priest, talking to the congregation, and they'd listen, and they'd let him tell them what to do. But if they got it from a scientist, they wouldn't. And I have heard the same thing about, well, climate change is political too. But, so therefore, if you want them to work together, isn't it best to try very hard to convert some of the leaders to the other cause? Because then they'll listen in a way that they won't when they sense that their leader is antagonistic.
I think that's a profound insight, and it's something that we sort of think about and we know, yet at the same time, sometimes we sort of devote a lot of resources in different kinds of directions. Why send Peace Corps workers? Why send 20-year-olds from the United States to tell people, how they should wash their hands, how they should live their lives, how they should think about sex and reproduction, when you can instigate those conversations, and it can be a debate within the communities themselves, right? I think how do we nurture the conversations that are happening in communities, right? Sometimes it doesn't need to be didactic, from the outside. The new information is very, very helpful. But when people are going to 8 funerals in a month, they're talking about that, right? There's no world in which we think that, other people, the global health community put this on people's radar, right? People knew. They're talking about this. They're trying to figure it out themselves. And so when the clarifying information can be conveyed by a trusted source, that settles in really quickly. And so I think that understanding where the trust already is, and then also where the mistrust is, because it wouldn't operate that way in all communities, but specifically in Malawi, I think you're exactly right.
And this is where social science of religion, I think, can be particularly helpful, as well as other bodies of social science. We know from theoretical frameworks, or I mean by theory, the way that the social world works, assertions about the way the social world works that then are testable through data collection, that something called the contact hypothesis. And so the contact hypothesis would argue that if you have a social relationship and you're stereotyping some other group, if you're exposed to someone of that other group and you become friends with them, say, your barriers to that social group might be broken down. But only if that person defies your stereotypes. If that person confirms your stereotypes, right, then your barriers might actually become even more rigid. You're like, oh, I had this bias towards thinking all scientists are atheists. Yep, met another one. He might be a nice guy, but kind of confirms my stereotypes. And so that's why Chris and I argue in some of our work that we ought to start, if we do want to break down barriers between religious communities and scientific communities, we might do well to start with people who have a leg in both worlds, right? So if I maybe trust the person who serves on some church committee with me, and then I find out later, oh, she's also a scientist. Okay, well, that's not what I thought scientists were. And that kind of, it starts to just break that stereotype a little bit.
Kirby, and then
Right. We've asked several questions related to language, and y'all all mentioned language at some point in talking about the relationship between religion and science. And I wanted to ask, just in terms of framing, even recently with the issue with the CDC in Atlanta and talking about evidence-based or fact-based, the distinction between facts and values, value neutrality in science, raises suspicion. And I'm curious, like in each of your experiences, how you or what you would recommend, because it seems like when sent to start with science says, or the facts are, for those that are not, well, for a lot of people, that just automatically raises suspicion. So how would you try to get at that without venturing into total relativism, right? So there are some things we can know. So anyway, y'all can all speak to that.
I'll take a stab. One thing that is that I think productive to this end, and I will mention by name a wonderful person named Susan Newcomer, who was my program officer at the National Institutes of Health. And the reason that any of this research was possible was because there was a lot of grumbling and a lot of concern about abstinence-only education and about foreign aid and specifically interventions in HIV being, basically having restrictions on them in terms of like what could be discussed if it were sponsored by this certain USAID grant or other sorts of things. And Susan Newcomer is an amazing person, and she intervened very, very quickly, and she said, this is an empirical question. We will have a call for proposals. And said, what is the impact of this, right? Like, what kind of teachings matter? Before we, go in circles and circles and circles arguing about which way is better, let's gather some data, right? And so having program officers who can guide the agenda and incorporate values, right, into scientific processes, I think is very important, because I think without them we won't be able to do any of this type of research. So I think that's just one possible, intervention.
I have a lot of thoughts about this, actually. One is that I think, as you said, empirical question. Your question actually brings up like research ideas for me, right? Like what you can almost do like vignette experiments to see like what kinds of framings are most appealing to particular audiences. That would actually be kind of an interesting thing to do. But I think maybe more broadly, like anyone who's written like a grant proposal, say for like National Science Foundation, you have to have this paragraph about broader impacts, right? It's basically like, how is this going to help society in some way? That's roughly. But I think when we're talking about framing, leading with that is kind of, in an NSF proposal, you have 14 pages on all the technical science stuff, right? And then you have like a paragraph on broader impacts. But that broader impacts is kind of your foot in the door with maybe other communities, right? That they don't necessarily care about all the front end stuff, right? They want to know how it might help in some way. And so I think leading with that kind of thing is important. So.
That's a very complicated but very thoughtful question. I did media training at Rice University once, and their primary critique of me is that I started every sentence with, it's nuanced. And that the person who was training me said, no member of the general public wants to hear it's nuanced. But research is nuanced, right? So we may agree as scientists on the methodological approach to get at a social problem, but How we then utilize the findings of data to address that social problem is a matter of deep interpretation, right, and nuance. And often we don't even agree on the methodological approach to understand a particular social problem. So how do you then convey results of very complex research to a broader public in a way that is truly nuanced, which I think is the most accurate way to think about it? As academics, we seem to lead with the facts. We really believe, I mean, deeply, it's funny, it's like almost to a fault, that more information is better. That simply getting information out to people. Well, we actually have other social science research that shows us that that's almost never truly effective, that building relationships with people first and creating a kind of bridge over which we then pass information is actually the more effective way. And so we probably need to spend more time talking about effective ways in which to build bridges among social groups that we can then pass information, more nuanced information over. That's not a direct answer to your question, but I am, I think, talking about some things that are important to addressing your question in, I will say, a more nuanced way.
That's helpful.
I think actually that question was pretty close to this one. Is that, like, did you notice in the data any trends with like groups that had more populist type ideologies? Like the ones that I can think of are like groups that would say like the Bible can be understood by like little children, for example. So we can take it quite like that. Like, do you have any specific like suggestions for groups like that think that that are, I guess, ideologically opposed to nuance in order to get towards that? And I'm thinking specifically among evangelicals.
I'm going to kind of half answer your question. So one of the things we found in the survey data is we had the survey question where we just asked people, what do you perceive the relationship between religion and science to be? And we gave these options of like basically kind of the options Jenny laid out. Do you think they're in conflict? Do you think they're just totally different from each other? Do you think they can collaborate with each other? One of the things we found from that is that evangelicals are actually the most likely group to say that they think religion and science collaborate or can or should collaborate. They're actually also the most likely to say that religion and science are in conflict with each other, but it's the other, so it's kind of split, right? But, which, on the surface of it, you're like, oh, that's good, right? Like, collaboration's good. That's kind of what we're talking about, right? But when you look at other questions we asked in the survey, that gets a little bit more nuanced, right? We asked this one question about, do you think, I think it was scientists. Yeah, do you think scientists should be open to talking about miracles in their explanations, essentially? And it was something like 60-something% of evangelicals said, yes, definitely scientists should be talking about miracles in science, right? And then you go back to the previous question, you're like, okay, well, what does collaboration mean then, right? By collaboration, do you mean that scientists should be talking about supernatural stuff, right? And then that becomes really that's a different type of collaboration than obviously most scientists would be up for. And so I kind of trailed off, and I don't know I forgot how that relates.
So
to your actual question.
I do think let me try maybe. I do think that there is some stereotyping of what evangelicals think. So when we then, in other research that we've done where we ask scientists what they think about particular religious groups, we find that scientists actually think evangelicals have a ton of conflict with science. So here's where data can help dispel a little bit of myth making, right? So even if evangelicals don't think of collaboration in the way that scientists might want them to, we can perhaps at least in a kind of blunt way dispel the myth that evangelicals aren't open to any kind of collaboration. And here's where I think we need to get a little bit utilitarian. So anyone who knows me well knows I'm not at all a utilitarian person. I'm actually not at all. So this is kind of funny for me to hear myself say. But I think we would do well to start with the low-hanging fruit issues first, right? So there is a sense where both scientists and, if you want to say, you mentioned evangelical Christians, so I'll use that group because I think that's who we're often talking about in the science and faith conflict, that there is the sense where both groups want to see humanity flourish. I think they have a different understanding of what full flourishing means, but both groups might like to see medicine be more effective in decreasing certain types of health concerns. And so that's like we have a, if you think about your Venn diagram, that's an overlap where we can really get on board together. So let's start there and then, move out from there in terms of understanding of other issues that are more difficult. But I think we don't even go to the obvious low-hanging fruit things at all. We skip right over to the issues because we have a predisposition to want to search for conflict. There's cognitive scientists who would tell us why. But I think that is a very interesting question you raise. Yeah.
May I ask one other question, maybe starting with Jenny, because in a lot of the work I do in writing about research on religion, it seemed to be encountering more and more studies, which kind of lead up to the thousands of studies on religion and health. Some of which have different findings, but one might say, as Chris Ellison did in his presidential address at SSSR a couple of years ago, one might say there's no denying there's a consensus that religion seems to have a protective effect on in many areas for certain people, from drug addiction to mental health, to one of the most recent studies I read was on older foster children as they exit out. And you're increasingly seeing in the findings and the implications that medical practitioners must take this into account. And it would be, and you do have a sense from some reading that major schools are integrating this into their curriculum. But I wanted to ask, well, first you, Jenny, and then if Chris or Elaine wanted to add anything, whether, how much progress do you think we're making in that area?
I've read about it. I'm familiar with the consensus about religion and health, and I've read about some interventions in medical school curricula in some areas. It probably depends very, very much about where you're going, where you're in med school, sure, and how open any professor is back to the scientists and the distinction between scientists and practitioners and physicians, how open any person is to adding that to an already full curriculum. If I think it's a hard thing to squeeze in, and I don't know if it will make it to the top. I'm guessing that it's on the list of things that we wish was being, sort of discussed more. But there are long hours and full curricula, and lots and lots of demands being put on, how we're training people, and so I'm guessing that it's very uneven. But I think also it's one of those things where the consensus is fairly recent. That's going to it's going to take some time to take root, right? We're not going to see that showing up right away because probably, people who have been practicing for 30 years are not going to change in sort of what they do day to day and start asking these questions and, asking their patients about their meditation practices or about their social networks, specific to religion or religious causes of stress. But if the next cohort of practicing physicians is seeing if that's part of their practice and it's positive and it's supported, then I think we'll see a lot more of that. So I think it's a really interesting thing to follow. I'd place some bets, but but I think it'll take some time to find out how that really grows in the profession.
Just a couple of quick thoughts. When we're talking about common ground, we are not asking pastors or religious leaders to then become scientists And I think in the religion and health connection, we shouldn't ask doctors to then become religious leaders, right? And so there are potentially practitioner boundaries which are interesting, and that would be unfair. On the other hand, as Jenny, I think, correctly said, there is a room for physicians and other medical professionals to be made more aware. There's some interesting research going on at Brandeis University that Wendy Cadge is leading, where she is putting together groups of medical school people, but also chaplains, and thinking through what are more creative ways that these groups can join together. So I think that's very much related to our conversation. And then a second thought from putting on my researcher hat is certainly the connection between religion and health has been established, but we need more thoughtful reflection on the mechanisms that establish that connection and under what conditions religion and what kind of religion is beneficial for health or not beneficial for health, and what kind of health. So I think we need to vary the religion, vary the health, if I'm thinking about a quantitative model, and to look at the connection in between and what kind of pathways exist there. So that's for lots of dissertations to be done. But
yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is, I mean, obviously you have to think about what can be translated to a doctor in a more applied setting. That, if from the survey research or the data show that people who believe in God have better health or whatever it might be, and I go to tell a doctor that, the doctor's going to be, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I can't prescribe belief in God or something, right? So, I mean, I think where you actually see the translation possible are things like meditation, right, and yoga and things like that. But also just in terms of being willing to talk with patients about spiritual and religious issues when they come up, right? So.
Well, thank you very much, and thank all of you for this wonderful conversation. Again, we extend thanks to our audience across the globe listening in. Each of this conversation will be archived on both the sites of the Association of Religion Data Archives and the International Association of Religion Journalists, and we encourage you to visit both those sites for all the GlobalPlus resources. Outstanding overviews of critical issues in international religion written by journalists and scholars throughout the world. Before we express our final appreciation for our panelists, I'd just like to recognize a couple of people that made this possible and made it possible to extend this seminar to a great number of people in different regions of the world. And first is Rachel Galloway. Rachel, can you please stand up? Center of Spiritual and Ethical Development. And Chris Walmark, who's taped this for us. Thank you, Chris. And can we please give just one final recognition of the panelists? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.